Everyone, I guess we're live. Nice for you guys to see us. I guess we can't really see you, but we're really happy to be here. Gian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Gian Franco. I am the co-founder of the Stereotype Project Foundation. We started the foundation in 2020, but my journey with the project started probably around 2015, leading up to the 2016 general election. Um, I think it was an interesting time for everybody. And, I was becoming increasingly frustrated with sort of the fracturing of dialogue within the country. And so anytime I find myself personally in a situation where I don't particularly like it, I ask myself, how did you get here? And I kind of turn that question to the country. And that sent me off on an odyssey of research, which resulted in this white paper, and ultimately birthed the Stereotype Project. And so for the last 6 or so years, I've sort of been focused and delving into that area.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Lynda Negron. I'm the head of product here at Pando. So before Pando, I actually started my career as a career engineer. I was a software engineer for a couple of years and experienced some not so great situations myself personally. That got me very passionate about the topic of unconscious bias in the workplace. Since then, I have been very passionate and vocal about this topic, everywhere from advocating for unconscious bias trainings at the companies I've worked at, all the way to before Pando, working at a startup that was focused on the conscious management of unconscious bias at Fortune 500 companies. So this is definitely a topic that Gian and I have quite a bit of experience in and quite a bit of passion in. So we're really excited to have this fire chat to just let you all know what we've learned about unconscious bias and how to mitigate it in the workplace, both individually and systemically. So what is bias? And I think that this is a very big topic that we need to cover first before talking about how to mitigate it, because unconscious bias is such a buzzword, and I feel like a lot of people have projected a lot of different meanings onto it. So I feel like, Gian, I think that this is the perfect time for you to jump in and talk about the differences between what is bias and what is actual racism. And I think those two get conflated a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things that really sort of jumped out to me as I was sort of doing the research and talking to people through this journey was this distinction between racism and prejudice, right? And I like to say, I think we're a lot less racist than we think, and we're a lot more prejudiced than we realize. And that's sort of a universal thing. I think we're wired for prejudice just because it's sort of survival instinct. We need to make decisions quickly, oftentimes for our own safety, but also just to get through the day. If you were to consciously make a decision about every single thing that you had to do in a day, you probably wouldn't make it through your front door, right? So we are wired to put things in boxes to sort of shortcut. And that will spill over to every area of our lives. And I think when that sort of prejudice, right? Because that's literally what it is, to prejudge, starts to spill into how we start interacting with one another. That's when I think it gets dangerous. That's when the shortcuts that can potentially disenfranchise an individual or an entire group of people become really, really dangerous. And so, as you said, prejudice has sort of been rebranded as unconscious bias now. And I think when people fully understand that it's truly universal, and that we're all susceptible to it, it's only then that you can start making conscious decisions to combat it.
Yeah. And so to jump on that from more of like the neurological standpoint, when we talk about how it genuinely affects everyone, we really mean it. Just from a neurology perspective, our brain makes millions of decisions a second. And that includes everything from just breathing to understanding where your eyes start to. You are receiving millions and millions of inputs every second. Like, someone was just blowing their lawn, not blowing their lawn, blowing the leaves outside right in front of my patio this morning. And I'm not consciously processing that that's happening. I am just receiving that input and locking into my brain like, oh yeah, like that is something that's happening around me. And I might not be consciously aware of it, but I am unconsciously aware that it's happening. So by that, we mean, only 10% of our thoughts and decisions are made consciously. Over 90% of them are done unconsciously. So that's everything from breathing to if I have to scratch an itch or everything like that. That's all happening unconsciously, including processing of all of these different stimuli that we're receiving. So as Gian said, we can't possibly make conscious decisions for every little stimuli that comes in. So our brain relies on shortcuts. So it's specific patterns so that our brains don't short circuit. A survival example is if I, thinking about like our ancestors foraging through forests, trying to find what berries to eat. If there was like a very obvious berry that looked like other berries that had made them sick or were not delicious or something of the sort, they would not try to eat a berry that looked like the other ones that they know were not good. So it's a very subconscious prejudgment of either past experiences or things that you've already been told, because we even see it now to like our generation where I might see the same berries and just know that I shouldn't eat them, but I can't tell you why. It might just be that I have learned that from education throughout my whole life and never actually challenged it myself. So, yes.
Yeah, I think, and that part, that not knowing where it came from, that's what's sort of been the most interesting part of this for me, right? Because we do this pattern matching where we're like, oh, this is familiar, but I don't know why it's familiar. I don't know where that information came from. They talk about the quadrants of competence, right? You have your conscious competence and then your unconscious competence. And I think that sort of area of just collecting information as we go through life is really, really powerful and can be really, really dangerous as well. And so, with the work that we're doing and understanding how information gets disseminated in mass media and particular archetypes and stereotypes and mental models are created that multiple generations later, I can't tell you why I'm looking at this berry and I'm like, yeah, it's not going to happen. I'm having a visceral sort of response. But until we sort of understand and can really dig into those things, I think we run into this bias problem, and it can be really, really dangerous.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is, these things don't work in a vacuum, right? So you're at home, you're having your shortcuts firing and you're making it through the day, but then you go into an institution and an organization and all of that multiplies, all of that happens at scale. And then you have people in positions of power, executives or gatekeepers or leaders who may be bringing those things with them, and then they get codified systemically into an organization's culture, into its structure, into its rulemaking and its policy. And I think that understanding, if, breaking systematic bias in an organization or in the world, I think starts with that individual realization. Unless you are conscious, unless you're aware that it's happening, not to say that you can stop it at every single turn, but you have to be aware that it's happening to be able to do something about it, right?
Yeah.
Nothing measured, nothing gained.
Definitely. So I think that with that, we can go on to talking about how we can interrupt bias at the individual level. And I think a perfect example of what you just talked about, how it like maybe one person's individual bias may end up catapulting into a variety of policies that end up oppressing a specific kind of demographic is, pregnancy, I think, is a great example of how for, generations, an individual can be taught either subconsciously or consciously, or they may just see it in the media, or it might just be the way that pregnant people are treated, where, pregnant women may not work as hard, or like they might, after they give birth, they might just want to go home and be with their child, which is completely fine and something that should be like celebrated and encouraged. But at the same time, there are plenty of women who want to work and still be viewed as career women after the fact. And if someone's subconscious has taught them that if a woman is pregnant, she will not continue in the workforce, they are going to actively not put in resources to help someone come back from maternity leave, or they may create policies that actually hurt women who, want to get pregnant or start a family in the future or continue having children. So there's a variety of ways in which someone's unconscious bias, where they might not consciously realize that they think that, just because it's something that they just assumed that was, a fact, may end up hurting a very, very large percentage of people.
No, absolutely. One of the most interesting things about that is that a lot of the times, if you're negatively affected by something, you may assume that the intention was negative, right? That the person who is affecting you in this way is deliberately navigating and orchestrating things to make you feel that way. And sometimes it's oftentimes with the best of intentions, or just being so oblivious that they don't think that this is sort of how it's wired. I think prejudice is so deeply personal. It is a manifestation of your entire life's journey up until that point. It is what you've seen on television, how you've heard people around you who you care about and respect and look up to talk about other groups of people or other things that they may be saying offhandedly, but they may not realize that they are planting the seeds of a particular train of thought that you may carry on, and then with confirmation bias, continue to reinforce that belief as you go. Right. And so if these things aren't interrogated at the root, or you're not conscious of the fact that these things are happening, you end up in an organization and you're like, yeah, well, these are foregone conclusions about women who are pregnant, and so we should operate in a particular way. And I'm not going to check in with the pregnant women or women in general or anybody else as I'm sort of moving forward with these policies, because again, it's a foregone conclusion and I'm not checking myself. And so I think, again, going back to sort of that individual realization and checking checks and balances before we can actually fix the systemic issues is critically important to the process.
Definitely. So I think it's important to note that in order to interrupt bias at a systemic level, we also have to interrupt it individually first. So I feel like, Gian and I talked about this a lot. I think that a lot of companies will implement unconscious bias training and hope that that's enough. But the reality is that a 90-minute seminar is often not enough. Like, you have to be actively aware when that bias is coming into play. And so I think the first step that actually, you would be surprised how much it helps, is just the acceptance that a bias exists and that everyone has it. I can't recall the study specifically, and I wish I had the numbers so that I'd added more legitimacy, but there have been proven studies that people who don't believe that they are biased or that they have bias are significantly likely to be more biased. So just the pure acceptance of saying that you are biased actually makes you less biased, because when you admit it and you consciously move with the assumption that you are much more likely to analyze yourself and correct yourself and accept the feedback of when you are being biased. So that acceptance is definitely the first element of this, is just saying we should operate with the assumption that everyone has some level of bias, and we don't know, against whom, for what, but just acknowledging that if our brains were wired to receive, to create certain patterns, and so that we should always be challenging ourselves, because those biases may exist from childhood, but they might have also developed over time just from the media that we consume.
No, absolutely. And I think that acceptance of bias is, I feel like the flip side of that statement is not being defensive, right? And so, hopefully with this realization that, like, everybody's prejudice, and everybody's prejudice in many scenarios, it's just a matter of being aware, kind of opens up the opportunity to have a conversation about that, as opposed to immediately feeling as though you're being attacked individually because of who you are, what you look like, or what groups you're a part of, right? Mm-hmm. And so that acceptance, again, is realizing that, hey, we're all human. But I think the other part of that acceptance is realizing that you are not necessarily your values, right? And those things are open to change. I think, particularly with the pandemic, we were able to see that people went into camps, right? And they still are in camps and digging their heels in, because if they're point of view is being challenged, it's almost like an attack on them personally. And
Mhm.
if it's attack on you personally, all of the psychological things that are associated with that sort of start to go into overdrive. I think if we can, more of us can realize that, hey, I am me and my values are sort of separate from me. That also allows my values and my opinions and my perspective to evolve and change as they should, as we grow as individuals and as we sort of navigate this life, right? And so that opening up of space, that ability to be open-minded and acceptance, exactly as you said, provides opportunity for people to actually do the work to self-evaluate, and that's where I think the magic can happen.
Definitely. And I think that ties into receiving feedback and being open to receiving it. So we constantly joke around where if you receive feedback, if you're an engineer and you receive feedback about your code, your first reaction is not to think, oh my God, I'm a terrible engineer. This is horrible. Like you're calling me a bad engineer. Like I don't want you in my life anymore. So why is it that when someone gives you feedback about how a particular policy can be, discriminatory against a particular person, or you may be exhibiting certain signs of bias and not even realizing it, then the attack becomes personal. And then you see how someone's whole, physiology changes when when you're trying to call them out on something. And so it's important for the individual to be accepting of all feedback that comes in and, take it as you would any other feedback. If someone is telling you, hey, by the way, like this particular thing, this is not inclusive, don't have your first reaction be, oh, so you think I'm racist. It's, whoa, why are we jumping to that conclusion? I'm just letting you know that this is how you're impacting people, and you should take that feedback the same way that you would take any other feedback. Maybe that means taking some space to be able to digest it better, but having the ability to actually digest that feedback is very important.
No, absolutely. And you know what? I would also say how that feedback is given as well, right? The same way as you're talking to an engineer and you're saying, hey, this is your code and this is an evaluation of your code. I'm not evaluating you as an engineer, right? There may be scenarios where that is actually happening, but generally when you're giving feedback about code, you're not giving feedback about that individual, right? Their values or their ability to code. You're talking about that within context. And similarly, I think the more we can have the conversation about the action and the behavior and not the individual, it becomes less of an indictment and more of a situation that can be evolved and can be changed and can be assessed objectively, as opposed to, again, with that defensive mindset.
Definitely. Another great tactic is this concept of network mapping. So that's helping you proactively understand your blind spots. So this is a technique that a lot of consultants use, which is having an individual actually sit down and map out every individual that they interact with on a regular basis. So think on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, and think about the demographics of those individuals and who is not included in that. And the reality is that the people that you interact with the least tend to be the people that you have bias for the most, because you do not have exposure that allows you to humanize those people. And a great example of that is, at the end of the day, like bias is a prejudgment of people. The more you get to know someone, the less likely you are to judge them. And the more people in your network and your circle who are of a particular demographic, and the more you've humanized those people, the less likely you are to have bias of that particular demographic in general. So if you realize that your network is lacking a particular demographic, then that might be a spot that you have a blind spot. So that is a clear indicator that that's a place where you can proactively be figuring out if you have bias and analyzing your life for that particular demographic.
No, absolutely. And there's so many really interesting studies around network mapping and the impact that it has from early childhood, but also within an organization, right? So a study was done that I found out about recently that showed that a child's level of social awareness and racial sort of sensitivity is directly linked to the amount of the amount of diversity in the friend circle of the mother, right? And that is because based on who is allowed into the home and who is given that access to that space is an indication of who the mother cares about and who is worthy to be cared about, right? And so the less diverse or the less inclusive that space is, the less inclusive that child goes up believing sort of different groups are worthy of that space and of that inclusivity. But then you fast forward into the work environment, and when you're thinking about referrals and sourcing people to work within an organization, or people whose work ethic or their competence that you trust, when you are tapping into your personal network, if your personal network is very homogenous, it's going to perpetuate this homogenous nature of your organization, right? And I think a great example of that is the NFL and the Rooney Rule, right? And the requirement that even if that person isn't hired, that you need to go and find an African American or somebody, a diverse potential hire, to interview and evaluate. There's a lot of sort of work that needs to be done in terms of the validity and the integrity of that process. But at the same time, the intention is there, and it's acknowledging the fact that if I'm a head coach of a football team in particular environments, outside it, there's the players, but then my personal network of peers and colleagues may be very homogenous. And so to get out of that mindset, to get out of that bias, to get out of that comfort zone, is really important that we sort of make those efforts. So yeah, absolutely. I think that initial evaluation of like, who are the people that I keep around me, right? What is my 7 closest people? And then beyond that, they talk about the Dunbar number of the 150 people that you can keep sort of top of mind. What does that look like? And I think it's very insightful in terms of what your world and the world that you're projecting will be.
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess another way of interrupting individual bias is priming. So as we said before, exposure really matters, but exposure doesn't necessarily need to happen through individuals. It can also happen through media, like what kind of media you're consuming. We found that a lot of research is showing that, in the implicit association tests, the ones that can measure bias, scores are much more likely to decrease, significantly more likely to decrease, if before the test, an individual has been shown images of individuals that are stereotype breaking. So an example of that is an implicit association test of, Black people and white people, like to see if you have more bias towards one particular demographic. You're more likely to have less bias against Black people if you see images of Black innovators, scientists, politicians, very powerful and stereotype breaking individuals before that test. So if that's proven true, then a way to help actually reduce that bias is to actively analyze the media that you're consuming. Like, is that media actually perpetuating any stereotypes? Because if it is, it's much more likely to negatively impact you. Finding ways of finding research and news that, actively supports and uplifts a particular oppressed demographic is actually very helpful and a very helpful means of mitigating your bias long term. So, Gian, this is the perfect topic for you to take away.
No, absolutely. This is sort of the core of the work that we do at the Stereotype Project and the impact that we want to have, right? And so, as part of that white paper and that research, it was really blow mind for me how much mass media plays a role in defining the narrative around various groups that we may not necessarily have the opportunity to personally interact with, right? And it's so powerful because these are images that we're seeing across media, and then they become perpetuated by us, right? If I am a storyteller and I am trying to, within a 30-minute episode, tell a story, I need as many shortcuts as possible so that I can do as much character development as I can with the limited time and space that I have. And so it is no surprise then that if I need to tap into particular characters, I'm going to lean on archetypes. I'm going to lean on particular stereotypes of characters because I know that you as a viewer, when you see that image, know exactly who that person is. I don't have maybe 300 minutes to take you through this person's life story and sort of explain how they got to the point that they got to, particularly if that point of view is typical, right? And so the mass media, I think there's so much of a responsibility in the images that we portray and how loosely we may portray those images. Now, there may be scenarios where we do absolutely want to lean into those stereotypes for either dramatic effect or satirical effect. But I think when it becomes sort of a foregone conclusion that, oh, this character is going to be this, because it's just an easy shorthand way for me to get my point across, that's when we really need to interrogate and evaluate what we're doing. Because as you said, this is where we learn. This is where these images are priming us, not only for our entertainment, but for our daily lives. And so if I'm consuming content that isn't self-regulated, or I am not taking the opportunity to actively seek out images that break stereotypes, I'm just going to be sitting down consuming sort of this continual perpetuation of images that aren't helpful and are oftentimes not at all accurate, right? And then when you go back and you talk to individuals and you're sort of like, okay, so this stereotype that is widely held, where did that come from? People often have no idea. And then when you take them through the history of where that came from, it's quite shocking. And so that's another big part of what we're doing with the Stereotype project. The goal is to build the world's largest database of stereotypes across every group, across every culture, in every country. And so with that, there will never be, hopefully, this is our dream, that there will never be a situation where you can be like, oh, that's what that means? I didn't know. There will be a full database with encyclopedic information on the entire history, the origin, the backstory, who started the stereotype, why was it started, how it's been perpetuated in mass media, and what's the implications of that perpetuation. And I think the more we have access to this information, the more responsible we can be, but then the more diverse the representation that we can have, right? I think, if we can get to a point where future generations grow up in a world where there are so many different types of representations of individuals, that if I meet another Asian person or somebody who's disabled or somebody who's from Latin America, that they could be so many things that I can't come to conclusion about any one thing. I think that's sort of the optimal priming, where you've been primed to so many different options that you can't lock in on one. And then what do you have to do? Actually go and connect with that person. You have to go and meet that person as an individual and realize that not only based on what they look like, what they represent, they're a member of a particular group, but they're also a member of a number of other groups that you may not be able to see based on what they look like. And that is just as much a part of their personality and their identity as the things that you can see. And that's when we start treating each other as individuals. And again, individually breaking that bias and that unconscious bias and that prejudice, because we're digging into who they are. And then that at scale becomes a really beautiful place, we hope.
Yeah. Well, we all believe in this project. So we only have a few minutes left. So I want to get to systemic approaches to reducing bias. And I also encourage everyone in the audience to, send over any questions that you have in the QA channel. We'll try to get to some of them in a couple of minutes after we talk about systemically reducing bias. So kind of like what we were saying is that running with the expectation that everyone has bias, that will be one of the main ways of actually reducing bias, is just moving forward with the assumption that everyone has it. So what policies can we put in place and what analyses can we do that will help mitigate it? So I guess one great example is standardizing feedback. So making feedback more competency driven. And so this is a great tie into Pando, because one of the studies that we did found that feedback, again, for women in POC, like in professional workplaces, tends to not have really any constructive feedback in it. And so when we've dug deeper, a lot of it is that managers don't want to upset women, and they think that constructive feedback would upset them. But for their male counterparts, they're giving constructive feedback, and that constructive feedback is absolutely critical to the development of a person. Like, if I've never received constructive feadback, how would I know what I actually need to work on? And so if everyone's just telling me, oh, you're doing a great job, but I never get promoted, it's the question is why? What is the reason for it? And so standardizing feedback into making sure that here's where you're doing great, here's where you need to work on, and always doing the Delta sandwich, trying to make sure that it's as competency based as possible and not including anything that is more personality detailed. And Gian, I think you can speak more to that as well. Really helps mitigate the systemic implications of bias, specifically in career progression.
Yeah, I think the famous test that that was done with African American names on resumes, and removing them and realizing that once you take out that bias because of who you think that person is, has a profound effect on people's ability to be hired. That permeates through everything, right? Like, yes, the names and African Americans, that's often the ones that come to mind, but everybody is carrying these biases, these preconceived notions about everybody in their organization. And so I think, the more it is about the competency, it's about the work, it's an evaluation of exactly what has happened, and not the vessel who created that work. The feedback can then become universal as well. And so people are going to respond to that feedback differently, right? What individuals choose to do with that feedback is going to vary from person to person, but at least the opportunity to do something is the same, right? And I think based on your experience and your worldview, you're going to approach situations, you're going to walk into rooms differently, with different preconceived notions. That should not be further compounded by the feedback loop as a function of who you are as an individual. I think providing that universal feedback is a really great first step to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to adapt. It's like the idea of the first rung on the ladder, giving everybody the opportunity to get to the first rung on the ladder, and then after that, whatever you choose to do. But
exactly. And again, making sure it's competency based, because a great example is that what women and people of color typically get feedback on their personality. So it's like, oh, you were intimidating, or you were unprofessional, and like, what does that mean? Whereas their counterparts receive feedback like, you could have executed this project better, or the communication here and here was lacking, and here are tangible ways of actually fixing that. So making sure that the feedback is always actionable, directed towards competencies and against action-oriented elements. Another way of reducing bias systemically is structured leveling. So pay inequity typically manifests when there isn't like a structured way of handling compensation. So again, maybe this is another plug for Pando, but I promise these are the only two. And creating structured leveling so that there are clear bands defined and clear competencies and expected behaviors per level, so that your comp explicitly matches the level, and a smaller comp band so that there isn't as much distinct pay inequity. That has also been proven to be one of the very few things that actually the only thing that like eliminates pay inequities at companies. So it's definitely something that we push for. Company perks. So analyzing your company perks, like what exactly are you, what kind of behaviors are you encouraging, and what kind of company are you facilitating with your company perks? An example of this is there was a study that showed that one of the very few ways of ensuring that women were in the C-suite is by promoting childcare as a company perk. And so it's interesting when you think about like how if you want more women in leadership, like childcare should be a company perk, or at least some kind of facilitation of it. But if you think about a lot of these big companies, like what are their company perks? Like a basketball court, free dinner. And then that's also like, wait, so you're telling me I have to stay in the office past 6 or 7 to get free dinner, which is also expecting that person doesn't have a family at home, or maybe even a life, or whatever that situation is. So like, what are you actually trying? What kind of culture do your company perks create? Because there's plenty of companies that don't do like free dinner or happy hours or anything like that, but all the money is put towards making sure all medical costs for an individual are completely taken care of, that like there is no cost out of pocket for an individual's medical expenses, childcare, some kind of work from home budget, or, things like that. Like flexibility, I think really matters. So Gian, I don't know if you have any thoughts here.
Yeah, no, I think, and it all goes back to your lens, right? Your prejudice. You are going to define spaces, policies, rules based on your own personal worldview. And so if your own personal worldview is that it's men in the C-suite, or it's generally men in leadership positions, you are not thinking about how to best accommodate female leaders or diverse leaders because your lens is so narrow. And again, it goes back to being aware that your lens is so narrow so that you can then do something about it, or at least get people in the room when you're making those decisions to be part of the decision making process. We just did a project for a company where we were talking about stereotypes within a very, very specific area. But one of the most critical and important things was making sure that you had the right people, and specifically women in the room, as you were having conversations about things that impact everyone, right? Because oftentimes your lens and your bias is so automatic that you think, okay, if we just have the smartest people in the room, everything will be solved. But you don't know what you don't know. And that's when, being aware that you don't know what you don't know becomes the first step in manifesting change.
Definitely. Another great example is blind resume review. So as Gian had mentioned, that specific study that said that African American names tends to get overlooked and not seen and not pass through to the interview stage, even if the same resume with a more traditionally American sounding name, or whatever you want to refer to it as, is sent in, it will receive significantly more hits and significantly more interviews. So removing any indication of name, ethnicity, gender from resumes actually does increase the pipeline a lot more. And it's one of those things where, like, when you implement that at a company, you do realize how the subconscious bias has affected people, because you do see the uptick in people of color and women after blind resume reviews have been implemented. Interview pool diversity. So just making sure that, where your recruiter sourcing from. Are they sourcing from only the same couple of pools? Or are they only sourcing from, the top 5 schools in the country? Or are they going out of their way to include other demographics? And I think that this is a great tie-in to the panel that Leslie Carr will be having later today, which is, getting candidates from more non-traditional backgrounds. So, candidates that can do the same exact job and bring a new perspective and a new light to it and really add to the company culture, but typically get overlooked because they don't have the same qualifications as another candidate. So just making sure that we're increasing interview pool diversity. And then a culture evaluation. So Gian, would you like to talk about this one?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for those last two, it's also really important, and I keep harping on this, that you have to be aware to want to do something. You then also have to want to do something, right? Deciding that you're going to do blind resume reviews is a detour from the typical and the easy way to approach a resume reviews. So is interview pool diversity, because you're now actively saying, hey, I need to go and find people that are harder to find because of how the world or how the organization or because of how the country is set up. And so that has to be a conscious decision, and it can't just be sort of a tokenized approach. You have to understand the value that diversity brings into your organization, and oftentimes that isn't actually quantified. The work isn't done. If you're in a huge organization that needs to go and make a multi-million-dollar purchase, ROI and investment is done to go and do that because that purchase is deemed important. And I think the same approach needs to be taken to diversity inclusion, not just as a tokenized, hey, let's check this box, but we actually understand that there's going to be a return on investment, the diversity of thought, the perspective. And again, when you think about D&I, sometimes you often go to race, but just talking about bringing women into the room and having them at the table, that perspective is valuable. Mm-hmm. Across cultures, across ethnicities, across groups, all of that value is there to be unlocked. So it has to be a conscious decision. And I think, we were talking about this a couple of days ago, but with respect to sort of the bounties, right? Like oftentimes for recruiting, there is a payout for bringing a great person into the organization. Well, obviously you're going to go through your network, going back to what your network mapping is, and find the best people in your network. Well, if there are incentives to make sure that diversity is there, those are always also other opportunities to make sure that people are appropriately incentivized to get the benefits of bringing in diverse people into to the organization, which is also, sorry.
No, I said definitely.
Yeah, no, which is what I was going to say is a segue into sort of the culture evaluation, right? And so companies do not have cultures, right? A company is a legal entity, but the culture is made up of the individuals within that organization. And so if the individuals who are leading that organization are predominantly white or predominantly of one sort of group, that ultimately is what becomes the culture, the general culture of the organization. And so, as we think about cultural diversity within a company, it can't be sort of antithetical to the core culture of the organization. I think the more we think about cultural diversity as an integrated reflection of the people in the organization, that's when you can start really moving the needle. I think with respect to the culture, however, culture can vary in an organization from level to level, right? So as a manager, if you're looking at your team, the diverse makeup of your team will define the culture of that team. That may be very, very different to the entire organization. It may be very, very different in a particular region than it is to the headquarters. But I think having a realization that, again, there is a separation between this corporate organization and the people that make it up, the more diverse the group of leaders and the people who can actually make decisions, I think the more diverse your organization is going to be. And that's a distinction that I think is important to be made. I know you were telling me about sort of celebrated holidays and how that could be affected by cultural diversity.
Yeah, definitely. So I do think we're over time and we're starting to bleed into the prep for the next speaker. So I wanted to say, I know we got a lot of great questions. What we can do is actually set up email threads with people who started asking questions. So I feel really bad that we didn't get to any. So I want to make sure that we do have at least some kind of communication. So maybe we can start a chat. I'll work with our head of marketing to see what we can do to keep the conversation going with the community. We thank you all so much for your time. We should definitely stick around. The next panel will be our CEO, Barb, and Jason Medley, the Chief People Officer from Codility, where they're going to talk about killing performance reviews and becoming an agile organization. So this is a talk that we're pretty excited about and would love for all of you to stick around for. So yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you for having me. Take care.